The night was cold and silent. A thick, dark forest surrounded the wreckage of what had once been a sleek and powerful spaceship. Now it lay broken and burned in the trees, a twisted metal skeleton of its former self. The ship had crashed hard. Its escape pod ripped from the hull in a violent explosion that sent it hurtling toward this strange, foreign planet. Zitali, an alien woman from the Velexi species, had barely managed to survive the crash. Her body was covered in bruises, and her arm was bleeding, the wound from the blast not healing as quickly as it should have. She looked at her surroundings in confusion and fear. The place was unfamiliar. There was no sign of other survivors, no sign of rescue. She had no idea where she was, and the stars above offered no comfort. "Mommy," a small voice whimpered beside her. Zitali turned her head slowly, her green eyes softening as she saw her daughter, Alara, clinging to her side. The little girl's silvery blue skin shimmered faintly in the moonlight. Her big eyes were wide with fear, and her small hands trembled as she grasped the hem of her mother's torn cloak. Zitali's heart broke at the sight of her child's fear. Alara had never seen anything like this. An unknown planet, a crash, and now they were alone. "It's okay, Alara," Zitali said gently, trying to steady her voice. She pulled the little girl closer, her own body shivering not just from the cold, but from the deep sense of dread growing in her chest. The wound in her arm was getting worse, and she could feel the infection spreading. She needed help, but where could she turn? The Velexi were a feared species in this part of the galaxy. They were known for their raids and their violent history with humans. She couldn't be sure how the humans on this planet would react to her. They might see her as a threat. Zitali glanced down at Alara, who was still holding onto her tightly. The little girl's eyes were filled with questions, but she stayed quiet, sensing her mother's fear. Zitali brushed the girl's hair back, trying to reassure her, though she didn't feel reassured herself. She could feel her strength slipping away, and they had no supplies, no food, and no shelter. She was a stranger in a strange land, lost and alone. The sound of the wind rustling the trees did little to ease her mind. What was she going to do? How long could they survive like this? "Stay close, Alara," Zitali whispered, her voice soft but firm. "We'll find help, I promise." But deep down, Zitali wasn't sure if that promise could be kept. What if no one found them? What if the humans here didn't care? Or worse, what if they attacked them on sight, assuming they were a threat? Zitali knew the answer to those questions would depend on whether they could find anyone before the infection in her arm spread further, before the fear and exhaustion took over completely. The night seemed to stretch on forever. The stars above them seemed distant, as if mocking their hopelessness. Zitali stumbled through the forest, her vision blurring as pain shot through her arm. Every step felt heavier than the last. She was getting weaker. Alara, her face pale, followed quietly behind her, holding onto the long sleeve of her mother's cloak for support. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence, a low rumble in the distance. Zitali froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Was it a predator? Some wild animal that could attack them? Her breath caught in her throat, but she held her ground, trying not to show fear. Then she heard it more clearly, a vehicle, its engine loud and steady. The sound grew closer, the headlights cutting through the trees like a sharp knife. Zitali's pulse quickened. A human vehicle. She wasn't sure what to do. Should she hide? Should she try to flee? If humans were anything like the Velexi's past enemies, they would be dangerous. But the vehicle wasn't moving fast. It slowed as it neared their location, and Zitali could hear it stop, the engine sputtering to a quiet hum. For a moment, everything was still. "Hey," a voice called out, startling Zitali. "You out there?" Zitali's breath caught in her throat. It was a man's voice, gruff but not unfriendly. It was clear, calling to her, as though he knew she was there. Should she respond? Zitali hesitated. This could be a trick. He could be trying to lure her out so he could attack her, or worse, capture her. But she couldn't run anymore. Her body was exhausted, her wound growing worse with each passing moment. If this was a trap, there was little she could do to avoid it. Instead, she called back, her voice weak but clear. "Please, help. My daughter needs help." There was a pause. Zaitali held her breath, praying that he wouldn't see her as an enemy, that he wouldn't hurt them. The next thing she heard made her heart leap in her chest. "All right," the man said, his voice softer now. "Stay where you are. I'm coming to you." The sound of footsteps crunching against the gravel was followed by the light of a flashlight cutting through the darkness. Zaitali squinted, trying to make out the figure approaching. A man, tall with broad shoulders, wearing a simple flannel shirt and boots. He looked like a worker, someone used to rough conditions. He stopped a few feet away from Zaitali and looked at her curiously. His eyes widened when he saw her, green skin, strange features, and the wound on her arm. But he didn't flinch. He didn't even reach for a weapon. Instead, his expression softened. "Whoa, you're hurt," he said. "You're not from around here, are you?" Zaitali shook her head, her voice trembling. "No, my ship crashed. I need help." The man didn't seem scared. He seemed more concerned than anything. He quickly assessed the situation, glancing from Zaitali to the little girl at her side, who was now clutching her mother's leg. The man crouched down to her level, offering a warm, inviting smile. "Hey, kiddo," he said gently. "You all right?" Alara nodded shyly, though she was still clinging to her mother, her eyes wide with uncertainty. The man turned his attention back to Zaitali. "You need medical help. I can't just leave you out here. I've got a place not too far from here. It's warm, safe. I can patch you up." Zaitali hesitated, uncertain. She didn't want to trust him. Humans were unpredictable, and she had no idea if this man was any different from the others she had heard of in her galaxy. But she was tired. So very tired. And Alara needed to be safe. Her heart ached with the thought of failing her child. "I thank you," Zaitali managed to say. "But can you help her too?" The man's gaze softened. "Of course. Let's get you both out of here." Without another word, he carefully helped Zaitali to her feet, supporting her as they began to walk toward his vehicle, the hum of the engine now sounding like a lifeline in the darkness. The forest was still around them, silent except for the sound of their footsteps and the distant hum of the truck's engine. Zaitali felt her strength slowly fading, but for the first time since the crash, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had found a way out of the darkness. The drive from the dark forest to the man's cabin felt like a lifetime. Zaitali, barely able to stay awake, rested her head against the cold window of the truck as the scenery blurred by. The truck's engine hummed steadily, its headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. Zaitali's thoughts were racing. She hadn't expected to find someone kind out here. Most humans, from what she'd heard, wouldn't have helped an alien, especially a Velexi. They'd seen her species as raiders and invaders in their past. Yet here was this man, this stranger, offering her help without hesitation. She couldn't help but wonder why. Was it kindness? Or was there something else? Beside her, Alara had finally fallen asleep in her mother's lap, her soft breathing the only sound in the cab. Zaitali gently brushed a strand of silver-blue hair from her daughter's face, looking down at her. Despite everything, Alara still managed to sleep peacefully, a small but beautiful symbol of innocence in a world that had turned cold and cruel. "Not much further now," the man said from the front seat, his voice calm and reassuring. "You'll be safe, I promise." Zaitali gave a faint nod, trying to reassure herself as much as him. She didn't know what to expect once they arrived, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a small spark of hope. The truck pulled up in front of a small, simple cabin, nestled in a clearing surrounded by tall trees. It was the kind of place that seemed untouched by time, like something out of an old story. A thin wisp of smoke curled from the chimney, and there was a warm, inviting glow spilling out from the cabin's windows. "This is it," the man said, stepping out of the truck and walking around to open the door for Zaitali. "Let me help you inside." Zaitali was grateful for his assistance. She hadn't realized how weak she was until she tried to stand. Her body felt heavy, and the pain in her arm had intensified during the drive. She had barely any strength left. Alara was still asleep in her arms as Zaitali stepped carefully out of the truck. "Take it slow," the man said gently, guiding her toward the front door. His hands were firm but not forceful, his touch showing nothing but concern. Inside, the cabin was warm, and the smell of something delicious filled the air, maybe stew or fresh bread. The fire crackled in the hearth, sending dancing shadows across the room. Zaitali couldn't help but notice the simple yet comforting atmosphere. The wooden floors creaked underfoot, and a small table was set in the center of the room, a few chairs pushed around it. The place was lived in, but it wasn't messy. It felt like a home, something she hadn't had in a long time. "Please, sit down," the man said, gesturing to the couch. "I'll get you both some water and make sure you're comfortable." Zaitali gingerly lowered herself onto the couch, still holding Alara. She glanced around the room, trying to take in everything, but her body felt too exhausted to focus. She closed her eyes for a moment, leaning back against the cushions, just letting the warmth seep into her bones. The man was quick to return with a glass of water, which Zaitali gratefully accepted, drinking it slowly to calm her dry throat. The sensation of the cool liquid was comforting, but it didn't completely chase away the fear gnawing at her stomach. She didn't know if she could trust him fully, not yet, but her instincts told her that he meant no harm. "I'm Travis," the man said, sitting down in the chair across from her. He seemed to be giving her space, not crowding her, but watching her carefully. "I've got some medical supplies in the back. Let me take a look at your arm." Zaitali hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She wasn't sure how much longer she could wait before the infection in her wound became too much. Her skin had started to feel feverish, and her arm was beginning to throb painfully. She carefully laid Alara down beside her on the couch, pulling a soft blanket over the little girl. Travis moved quickly but carefully, gathering the supplies from a small cabinet near the kitchen. Zaitali winced as he gently removed the torn sleeve of her cloak to expose the wound. It was deep, too deep for just any first aid. It had been a miracle she had made it this far. "Don't worry," Travis said as he noticed her flinch. "I've treated worse than this before. I'm not going to hurt you." Zaitali nodded, gritting her teeth as he carefully began to clean the wound. His touch was steady and skilled, and the sharp sting of antiseptic was more bearable than she expected. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. Travis was focused on his work, but there was something in his demeanor that told her he was genuine. She didn't sense any ill will in his movements, no hesitation, no suspicion. Once the wound was cleaned, Travis wrapped it in a bandage with practiced hands. The pain began to dull, and Zaitali let out a quiet sigh of relief. "There," Travis said, stepping back and giving her a soft smile. "That should hold for now. You need to rest, though. Don't push it." Zaitali gave a grateful nod. "Thank you for helping me. I didn't expect." "It's no problem," he interrupted gently. "I know what it's like to need help and not know where to turn." For a moment, there was a strange silence between them, and Zaitali couldn't help but feel a strange connection to this man. He didn't know her. He didn't know who she was or where she came from, but he had offered help without question. "You've been kind," she said quietly, looking down at her daughter, who was now softly stirring, waking up from her nap. "Kindness is easy when you're not worried about whether someone will harm you," Travis replied, his voice soft. "Besides, you look like you've been through hell." Zaitali managed a weak smile. She had been through hell, and she wasn't sure she would have made it without this man's help. "Is she all right?" Zaitali asked, glancing over at Alara, who had now fully woken up and was sitting up on the couch, rubbing her eyes. "Yeah, she's fine," Travis said with a reassuring smile. "I gave her some warm milk before I came back in. She'll be okay." Alara looked up at Travis, her big, innocent eyes studying him with curiosity. "Who are you?" she asked in a small voice. Travis chuckled softly. "I'm Travis. I'm just someone who likes to help." Alara seemed to accept that answer, though she still stayed close to her mother. Zytali smiled at her daughter's trusting nature. It reminded her that, no matter how hard things got, there was still innocence in the world. As the night wore on, Zytali slowly began to relax. The fire crackled in the hearth, and she could hear Alara whispering to Travis, asking him about his cabin and the animals he had around the property. There was something comforting about the normalcy of it all. The warmth of the fire, the soft voices, and the calm atmosphere. Travis made them both dinner, a simple but delicious meal of stew and bread. Zytali had never tasted food like this before, but it was soothing in a way she couldn't quite explain. As she ate, she realized how much she had taken basic comforts for granted before all of this. After the meal, Travis offered her a room where she could rest. "I know you've been through a lot. Get some sleep. I'll make sure everything's all right here." Zytali nodded gratefully. She was exhausted, both physically and mentally. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt safe. There was a sense of peace in the air that she hadn't felt since before the crash. Maybe it was too soon to trust completely, but for now, she would take it. As she settled into the bed Travis had prepared for her, she thought about everything that had led her here. The crash, the fear, the loneliness. But now there was hope. There was someone who had extended a hand to her when she had nothing left. Someone who had seen her not as a stranger, not as a threat, but as a person in need. And for the first time, Zytali allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had found a new beginning. The night passed quietly in Travis's cabin. Zytali woke up to the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth and the smell of fresh bread baking in the small oven. For the first time since the crash, she felt a strange sense of peace. The fear that had consumed her since she arrived on this planet slowly began to ease, replaced by a quiet hope. She hadn't expected kindness, especially from a human. And yet, here she was, resting in a warm, safe place, her daughter sleeping peacefully beside her. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt this way, like there was still a chance, like the world hadn't completely turned against her. But as the warmth of the fire spread through her body, she couldn't help but wonder, why had Travis helped them? He didn't know them. He didn't know what they were, where they came from, or even why they had crashed. Zytali's species, the Velexi, had a complicated history with humans. They were often seen as invaders, aggressive, ruthless, and driven by their own survival. How could someone like Travis be so kind to strangers, especially those who didn't look like him? Zytali's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. "Morning," Travis's voice called out through the wood. "I thought you might want something to eat before you get up." Zytali rubbed her eyes and sat up in bed, feeling the stiffness in her body. Her wound was still sore, but it didn't hurt as much as it had the night before. The bandages Travis had applied were doing their job, and she felt a little stronger than she had the day before. "Thank you," she replied quietly, though her voice was still hoarse. "We'll be right out." "Take your time," Travis answered. "I'm just making some tea, nothing fancy." Zytali slowly stood up, careful not to disturb Alara, who was still asleep in the bed next to her. The little girl had a peaceful expression on her face, the kind that reminded Zytali of how things used to be before their world turned upside down. Zytali's heart tightened as she looked at her daughter. Alara had been through so much already, and she was so young. It hurt Zytali to know that Alara had already seen so much pain in her short life. But for now, Alara was safe, and that was enough. Zytali quietly moved out of the room and into the main part of the cabin. The soft glow of morning light streamed in through the small windows, casting a warm, golden hue over the wooden walls. The fire in the hearth had died down overnight, leaving only glowing embers. Zaitali stood there for a moment, absorbing the quiet comfort of the cabin. Travis was at the small table in the corner, stirring a pot of something on the stove. The smell of herbs and something sweet filled the air. The cabin felt like a different world compared to the wreckage of her ship and the dark forest outside. Zaitali walked over to the table and sat down, still unsure of what to say or how to act. "You're up early," Travis said with a smile, glancing over his shoulder. "You can sit back, relax. No rush." Zaitali gave a small nod, watching as Travis poured the tea into 2 mugs and set one in front of her. It wasn't the best tea she'd ever had, but there was something comforting about it. Maybe it was the warmth or the simple act of sharing something so ordinary. She took a sip, the hot liquid soothing her throat. It felt good, even if her mind was still racing. "How long have you lived here?" Zaitali asked, trying to make conversation and distract herself from the worry gnawing at the back of her mind. "Long enough," Travis answered, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "About 5 years now. I used to live in the city, but I wanted a quieter life, away from all the noise and stress. It's not much, but it's mine." Zaitali nodded thoughtfully. She could understand that. After everything she had been through, the simplicity of life in this cabin seemed like a dream. A life without constant danger, without the fear of being hunted or forced to fight just to survive. "Do you like it?" Zaitali asked softly, her voice almost hesitant. "This life?" Travis paused for a moment, considering her question. "It's peaceful," he said finally. "But I won't lie, sometimes it gets lonely. I'm used to being alone out here, but every now and then I miss having someone to talk to, someone to share things with." Zaitali understood that too. She knew what it was like to be alone in a vast, unfamiliar place. She had spent years traveling through the galaxy, moving from one place to another, always trying to stay ahead of the dangers that seemed to follow her. She had been isolated in her own way, even surrounded by others of her kind. She glanced down at Elara, who had finally stirred from her sleep and was now sitting up in bed, rubbing her eyes. The little girl looked confused for a moment, but then smiled when she saw her mother sitting at the table. "Morning, Mummy," Elara said in her soft voice, her eyes bright with innocence. "Good morning, sweetheart," Zaitali replied, her heart swelling at the sight of her daughter's smile. Elara was everything to her, the reason she kept going, the reason she fought through the pain and the fear. The little girl climbed out of bed and walked over to where her mother sat. Zaitali reached out and pulled her close, wrapping her arms around her in a gentle hug. Elara leaned into her, resting her head on Zaitali's shoulder. "Are we staying here?" Elara asked softly, her voice full of wonder. "It's so nice and warm. I like it here." Zaitali didn't know how to answer. She didn't know how long they would stay or if it was even safe, but she didn't want to worry her daughter. Not now, when they were finally safe for the moment. "I don't know, sweetie," Zaitali said softly, "but for now we are." Elara smiled again, her eyes sparkling with a trust that made Zaitali's heart ache. She wanted to keep her daughter safe, wanted to give her the kind of life that was free from fear, but she didn't know how to make that happen. The universe was a dangerous place, and their ship had crashed in the most unlikely place. Would they ever find their way home? Zaitali's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Travis clearing his throat. "Well, I've got some more food ready if you two are hungry," he said with a grin. "And I was thinking we could talk about what you're planning to do next. I'm happy to help, but I don't know how long I can keep you here. I've got to get back to town in a couple of days." Zaitali hesitated. She didn't want to burden Travis with their problems. He had already done so much for them. "Thank you," Zaitali said, her voice filled with gratitude. "We don't want to be a bother." "You're not a bother," Travis said, shaking his head. "I wouldn't have offered to help if I didn't want to. but I understand if you want to leave once you're feeling better. You're not trapped here." Zitali felt a small knot loosen in her chest. She had been afraid that Travis would expect something in return, that he would ask for something she couldn't give. But he hadn't. Instead, he was offering them freedom, the chance to make their own choices. For the first time in a long time, Zitali felt a sense of relief. They weren't stuck. They had options. "I'm feeling better," Zitali said quietly, looking at Elara, who had just finished eating her breakfast and was now sitting contentedly at the table. "We'll stay for now, but we need to figure out what to do next." "That's fair," Travis said with a nod. "I'll be here to help however I can." The rest of the morning passed in a calm, peaceful haze. Zitali and Elara ate a simple breakfast of bread, eggs, and fruit that Travis had prepared. As they ate, Travis talked about his life in the cabin, telling them stories about his time in the city, the animals he had seen, and the days when the forest around him seemed to come alive. Zitali listened quietly, grateful for the distraction. She realized that she had been so focused on survival, on getting through the next day, that she had forgotten what it was like to simply talk, to enjoy small moments of peace. As the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Zitali realized that she was beginning to feel something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. There was still a long way to go, and the future was uncertain. But for now, in this warm, safe cabin with her daughter by her side, she could breathe again. And that was enough for now. The morning passed peacefully, a calm that felt like it could last forever. Zitali sat in the cabin with her daughter, Elara, as the sun's warmth streamed through the windows, bathing the room in a soft golden glow. The fire in the hearth crackled gently, and the simple smell of fresh bread and herbs still lingered in the air. For the first time in what seemed like ages, Zitali allowed herself to relax. Her arm, wrapped securely in clean bandages, didn't hurt as much anymore. Elara had returned to her playful self, giggling and chatting away as if nothing was wrong. It was as if the horrors of their crash, the uncertainty of their future, had vanished for a while. Travis, too, seemed content. He had been busy fixing up parts of the cabin, trimming back the plants around the yard, and talking to Zitali when she needed someone to listen. He was the kind of person who kept to himself, but there was a kindness in him that Zitali couldn't ignore. "I'm glad you're both feeling better," Travis said one morning as he finished cleaning up after breakfast. "It's good to have some company for a change." Zitali smiled, feeling a mix of gratitude and guilt. She was thankful for his kindness, but part of her felt as though they were a burden. They had arrived with nothing, and here he was, offering them food, shelter, and a place to heal. It was more than she could have hoped for. "You've done more for us than we could ever repay," Zitali said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. Travis looked up at her and gave a small shake of his head. "No need for that. I'm just happy to help. The world could use more kindness." But even as he said that, Zitali couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was a small voice in the back of her mind telling her that they couldn't stay in one place for too long, especially not with their history. The universe was too unpredictable, and no one was truly safe, especially when she was from a race that had a complicated past with humans. But she couldn't dwell on that now. For the moment, they had this peaceful life, and she needed to focus on making sure Elara stayed safe and happy. They were safe here, or so she thought. The day had started like any other. Zitali and Elara spent time together, and Travis worked outside in the garden. The warmth of the cabin felt like a refuge, and Zitali began to allow herself to believe that maybe they had found a place where they could rest. But peace rarely lasts. It was a little past midday when the first sign of trouble appeared. Zitali had just finished washing the dishes from lunch when she heard the sound of a vehicle approaching from down the road. At first, she thought it was just another passerby, maybe someone from the nearby town. But the sound of the engine grew louder, and something about it felt off. It wasn't the casual sound of someone driving through. It was the sound of a vehicle moving fast, almost recklessly. Zitali's heart skipped a beat. Her instincts, honed over years of traveling through dangerous worlds, kicked in immediately. She turned to Travis, who was still outside, working with his tools. "Travis," she called out, her voice sharp with sudden worry. "Someone's coming." Travis looked up from what he was doing, his face still calm but his eyes narrowing slightly. "Who is it?" "I don't know," Zitali replied, her voice tense. "But it's not a normal vehicle. Stay inside. I'll go check." Zitali's mind raced as she quickly moved toward the door. Her senses were on high alert, her body tense with readiness. She wasn't sure why, but a deep feeling of dread had settled over her. She knew trouble was coming, and it wasn't just any trouble. It was the kind of trouble she couldn't avoid. Alara, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, looked up at her mother with concern. "What's happening, Moni?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. "Stay inside, sweetie," Zitali said, her voice soft but firm. "Everything will be fine. I'll be right back." With that, she stepped outside and moved swiftly toward the edge of the property, where she could see the road coming into view. The vehicle was closer now, kicking up dust as it barreled down the dirt path. Zitali squinted, trying to get a better look at the approaching vehicle. It was a heavily modified truck, its black exterior looking almost military in design. The engine roared as it came closer, and the hairs on the back of Zitali's neck stood up. This wasn't a friendly visitor. This was something different. She stepped further into the woods, hiding behind a large tree, trying to remain unseen. She had to know who these people were and what they wanted before she did anything rash. The truck screeched to a halt just outside the cabin, kicking up a cloud of dirt. Zitali's heart pounded as she watched. She knew that if they found out who she really was, things could go terribly wrong. She was from the Velexi race, and the last thing she needed was for her presence to be discovered by the wrong people. Two men stepped out of the truck. One of them was tall and muscular, with a scruffy beard and a hardened look in his eyes. The other was shorter, wearing a hat that shadowed his face, and his posture was tense, as though he was constantly on alert. Both men had a rough, dangerous air about them. Zitali's mind raced. She had no idea who they were, but one thing was certain. They weren't here for friendly conversation. The taller man walked up to the cabin door and knocked loudly. There was a pause before Travis's voice called out from inside. "Can I help you?" "We're looking for someone," the taller man said, his voice rough and gruff. "A woman and a little girl. We've heard they might be around here." Zitali's breath caught in her throat. Her heart began to race. They were looking for her. But how did they know? Did someone see the crash? Had someone been following her? Travis, to his credit, didn't panic. He opened the door slowly, his expression calm but his eyes scanning the two men carefully. "I'm not sure who you're talking about," Travis said, his voice polite but firm. "You've got the wrong place." The shorter man stepped forward, his eyes scanning the cabin and the surrounding area. Zitali tensed, hidden in the shadows of the trees. She knew she couldn't stay hidden for long. If these men were looking for her, it was only a matter of time before they found her. The tall man's gaze shifted toward the forest, and Zitali's heart skipped a beat. He looked right in her direction, as though he knew she was there. He took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the woods. "You sure?" he asked slowly, his voice carrying an edge of suspicion. "We've heard rumors about a crash nearby, and we know someone's been hiding out in these parts." Travis stood his ground, but Zitali could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He didn't know what was going on, but he wasn't about to give up the cabin so easily. "Unsure," Travis said, his tone firm, but with an undercurrent of tension. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." The shorter man eyed Travis for a moment, then glanced back at the truck. He seemed to hesitate, as though considering something. Then, with a grunt, he turned to his companion. "Let's go," he said, clearly not convinced but deciding to leave for now. The two men walked back to the truck, and without another word, they climbed into the vehicle and drove off, kicking up dust as they sped away. Zitali let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She didn't move right away, staying hidden behind the tree for a moment longer. Her mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had they been looking for her? How did they know? And why had they left so easily? She watched as the truck disappeared down the road, her thoughts racing. She had to tell Travis the truth. There was no more time to hide. Trouble had found them, and it wasn't going to go away. When Zitali finally emerged from the trees, Travis was waiting for her, his expression worried. "Who were they?" he asked quietly. "They were looking for us," Zitali said, her voice heavy with concern. "They knew about the crash. They knew someone was here." Travis's face paled. "What do they want with you?" Zitali looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know, but I have a feeling this isn't over." The warmth of the hearth in the cabin suddenly didn't seem so comforting anymore. The calm they had felt just moments before was shattered, and the reality of their situation came crashing back. The universe had a way of turning even the safest places into places of danger. The trouble had come knocking, and now, Zitali knew, they couldn't hide anymore. The tension from the visit of the two strangers still hung in the air, thick and heavy. Zitali couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was lurking around every corner. Her thoughts were racing with questions. Who were those men? How did they know about the crash? And what exactly did they want with her and Alara? She had to admit, the uncertainty was unsettling. It wasn't safe here anymore. But for now, there was little she could do but wait and try to stay hidden. Inside the cabin, the warmth from the hearth still filled the room, but it didn't feel the same anymore. The comfort had been shattered by the threat that had appeared at their doorstep. Zitali felt a sense of urgency rise within her. Time was running out, and she had to think of a plan. But as she turned to see her daughter, Alara, sitting peacefully in the corner, drawing pictures on the floor, Zitali's heart softened. Alara was unaware of the danger. To her, this cabin, with its warmth and safety, was just another home. It was the one place where she could still feel the joy of childhood, the one place that wasn't filled with the endless flight from one threat to another. Zitali couldn't let that innocence be taken from her. She had to keep Alara safe. Taking a deep breath, Zitali put the thoughts of danger out of her mind. At least for now. She needed to focus on healing, both physically and emotionally. After all, she hadn't had the chance to rest since the crash. She had been so focused on survival and keeping her daughter safe that she had pushed her own needs to the side. But her body was telling her something different now. Her arm, though bandaged, still hurt, and her legs felt sore from the hard journey through the forest. She knew she couldn't keep going like this forever. Zitali sat down across from Alara, watching her draw with the intensity of a young child's concentration. The drawing was simple. Two stick figures holding hands, surrounded by a sun and a tree. Zitali smiled softly. "I like it," she said, her voice tender. Alara looked up and beamed. "It's you and me, Mommy. We're happy." Zitali's heart swelled. Alara's innocence, her ability to find joy in something as simple as a drawing, reminded Zitali of why she had to keep going. She was the reason Zitali was still alive. Her daughter was the one thing that kept her grounded, even in the most uncertain of times. "I think it's perfect," Zitali replied, her smile gentle. "You're a very good artist, Alara." The little girl giggled and went back to drawing, her small fingers working quickly and confidently. For a moment, everything felt normal again, as if they were just any other mother and daughter sharing a quiet afternoon. But just as quickly as the peaceful moment had arrived, Zitali's thoughts returned to the events from earlier. The strangers had been too close, too suspicious. What if they came back? What if they weren't just looking for anyone, but were actually searching for them? Zitali felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She couldn't stay here forever. But where could they go? She was snapped out of her thoughts by a gentle knock on the door. It was a soft, respectful knock, not the rough, forceful kind the strangers had used earlier. "Zaitali?" Travis called through the door. "It's me. Can we talk?" Zaitali hesitated for a moment before she stood and opened the door. Travis stood there, holding a basket of fresh vegetables and herbs from his garden. His face was kind but concerned, and it was clear that the visit from the two strangers had unsettled him as much as it had unsettled her. "Everything okay?" Zaitali asked, stepping aside to let him in. Travis nodded, but there was a tension in his shoulders that she couldn't ignore. "I just wanted to check in. I know things are a bit uncertain right now. I thought maybe we could talk about what's next." Zaitali frowned, unsure of how to answer. She didn't want to burden Travis with their problems, but she also knew she couldn't keep running. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. "Travis, I don't know what to do," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "Those men, they know we're here, and I don't know if it's safe for us to stay. But I also don't know where we can go." Travis set the basket down on the table and sat across from her. "I get it," he said. "I don't want to put you at risk, but you can't stay on the run forever. You and Alara need to be able to rest, to heal. And you need a safe place to do that. I've been thinking, maybe I can help." Zaitali looked at him, her mind racing. "How?" Travis smiled, but it was a tired, weary smile. "I've got some contacts in the nearby town. They're good people, quiet folk. I think they'd be willing to help if we ask. But we can't just go barging in. We need to be careful. I know a place that's safe, away from prying eyes. If you want, I can take you there." Zaitali felt a flicker of hope stir in her chest. A safe place. A place where they could heal without fear, at least for a while. But she hesitated. The trust she had in Travis was growing, but it wasn't easy to let go of the fear she carried. She wasn't used to depending on others. She had always been the one who kept moving, never allowing herself to settle. But things were different now. She had a daughter to protect, a daughter who needed a future. "I'm willing to try," Zaitali said quietly, her voice full of uncertainty, but also resolve. "But I don't want to put anyone else in danger." Travis nodded. "I understand. We'll take it slow. And we'll make sure it's safe. We can't afford to make any mistakes." As they talked, Zaitali's mind slowly began to calm. She still wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that there might be a way out of this mess, a way to protect her daughter, to find a place of peace where they could heal and rebuild. And maybe, just maybe, there was hope for a future, even after everything that had happened. As the afternoon passed, Zaitali found herself growing more and more exhausted. The weight of the past few days had taken its toll on her, and her body was demanding rest. She didn't want to stop thinking about the next steps, but she knew that she couldn't keep running on empty. "I think I need to rest," Zaitali said quietly, her voice filled with fatigue. "I've been pushing myself too hard." Travis looked at her with concern. "You've been through a lot. You need to take care of yourself. Don't worry about the next step for now. Just focus on healing." Zaitali smiled softly at him, grateful for his kindness. "I will. I promise." As she settled down on the couch, Alara crawled up next to her, resting her head on Zaitali's shoulder. For a moment, the world outside didn't matter. The danger, the uncertainty, none of it felt as important as the warmth of her daughter's touch. Zaitali closed her eyes, letting the soft sound of Alara's breath calm her thoughts. She wasn't sure what the future held, or if the danger from the strangers would return. But for now, in the safety of this cabin, with her daughter by her side and Travis's support, she felt a flicker of peace. Zaitali had come to realize that healing wasn't just about her body. It was about letting go of the fear, letting go of the constant fight for survival, and allowing herself to trust again. It was about bonding, not just with her daughter, but with the people who cared enough to help. And as she drifted off to sleep, Zaitali held on to that small flicker of hope, knowing that even in the darkest moments, there could still be light. The morning sun shone brightly through the small window, casting its warm glow over the cabin. Zytali slowly woke up, the events of the past few days rushing back into her mind. She could hear Alara humming softly beside her, the little girl happily playing with a small toy she had found in the cabin. For a brief moment, it felt like life had returned to some semblance of normalcy. But deep inside, Zytali knew better. They were still on the run, and the danger was never too far away. However, today, something felt different. Maybe it was the peace in the air, or the simple joy of watching her daughter play. Whatever it was, Zytali couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. She stretched slowly, feeling the aches in her body. Her arm, though still tender, had healed enough to allow her to move freely. The pain that had followed her for days was beginning to fade, and she found herself with more energy. Her mind was clearer, too. The dark thoughts that had clouded her days seemed a little less heavy. For the first time in what felt like ages, she was allowing herself to breathe, to think about something beyond survival. Alara noticed her movement and looked up with a smile that could light up the whole room. "Good morning, Mommy," she said excitedly. The little girl had a way of making even the simplest moments feel special, and Zytali couldn't help but smile in return. "Good morning, sweetheart," Zytali replied, brushing her daughter's hair away from her face. She kissed her forehead softly. "Did you sleep well?" Alara nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, I dreamed we were living in a big, pretty house, and there were flowers everywhere. And you were making dinner for us." Zytali laughed lightly, the sound like music in the quiet room. "That sounds wonderful. Maybe one day we can make that dream come true." The little girl's eyes sparkled with excitement. "I want to have a big garden with flowers, and we can grow strawberries. Can we, Mommy?" Zytali's heart ached, but not in sadness. Rather, it was the tenderness of knowing how much her daughter longed for a peaceful life. She nodded, her smile warm and full of love. "We can grow strawberries, Alara, and maybe even more than that. We can make it happen." The words felt hopeful, but Zytali knew that it wasn't going to be easy. They had been running for so long, always looking over their shoulders. But the idea of settling down, of creating a life where Alara could grow up without fear, had become more than just a wish. It was a need that Zytali would do anything to fulfill. As Zytali and Alara went about their morning routine, preparing for the day, a knock came at the door. It was gentle, but insistent enough to draw their attention. Zytali's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know who it was. She hadn't expected anyone today, and the peace of the cabin had left her feeling vulnerable. But then she reminded herself that they had to keep moving forward. They couldn't live in fear forever. She opened the door cautiously, her heart racing as she peered outside. Standing there was Travis, his face friendly, but there was a glint of concern in his eyes. "Morning, Zytali," he greeted her. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "No, not at all," Zytali replied, stepping aside to let him in. "What's going on?" Travis glanced around as he stepped into the cabin, his eyes scanning the surroundings. Zytali noticed the careful way he looked out the window, as though ensuring no one was watching them. She knew that look all too well. Something was up. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice steady, but with a hint of something deeper, something urgent. "I know you've been through a lot, and I don't want to pressure you, but if you're ready to move on, I can help." Zytali raised an eyebrow, confused. "Move on? Where to?" Travis shifted uncomfortably. "I know a place, far from here. It's secluded. No one will find you. It's a small community, mostly people who want to live quietly and keep to themselves. They won't ask questions, and they won't judge you. I think it could be a safe place for you and Alara to start fresh." Zytali felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. A place where they could start over. It sounded like a dream. A safe haven. But what if it was too good to be true? What if it came with its own set of dangers? She looked at Alara, who was happily drawing on the floor, unaware of the conversation taking place. Her daughter's face was lit up with joy, and Zaitali's heart softened. It would be worth it if this could give Alara the chance to grow up in a peaceful world. But could she trust Travis? Could she trust the safety of the place he was talking about? Travis seemed to sense her hesitation. "I understand if you're not ready," he said, his voice gentle. "But I just want to offer you a choice. I don't want you to feel trapped here. You deserve better than that." Zaitali closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She had been running for so long, always on edge, always afraid. The thought of having a place to call home, a place where Alara could grow up safe and happy, was more tempting than anything she had ever imagined. But it was a huge decision. She couldn't make it alone. "Let me think about it," she finally said, looking back at Travis. "I need some time to consider everything." Travis nodded. "Of course. Take your time. I'm here if you need anything." As Travis left, Zaitali closed the door and turned back to Alara, who was now playing with a small doll she had found in the cabin. The thought of a new beginning swirled in her mind, but she couldn't decide on her own. She needed to talk to her daughter, to gauge if she could even begin to imagine a life in one place. "Mommy, I want to pick flowers," Alara said, looking up at her with bright, eager eyes. "Can we go outside today?" Zaitali smiled softly and nodded. "Of course, sweetheart. Let's go pick some flowers." They walked outside into the bright afternoon, the sun warming their faces. Zaitali felt the breeze on her skin, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to relax. The weight of their past, the constant danger they had been running from, seemed lighter in that moment. As they wandered into the field behind the cabin, Alara laughed as she plucked flowers from the ground, weaving them into small crowns. Zaitali sat down nearby, watching her daughter with a sense of calm that she hadn't felt in ages. The thought of finding a place like this, a place where they could live without fear, suddenly didn't seem so impossible. Alara ran over to her, holding a flower crown in her hands. "Look, Mommy, it's for you." Zaitali smiled, accepting the crown with a soft chuckle. "Thank you, sweetie. It's beautiful." As she placed it on her head, she felt a wave of emotion rise within her. This was her daughter's dream. A simple, peaceful life. And it was becoming hers as well. They had been through so much. Loss, fear, pain. But in this moment, surrounded by nature, she realized that a new beginning wasn't just about running from danger. It was about creating something better, something more meaningful. Later that day, Zaitali went to Travis, her decision finally made. "I'm ready," she said quietly. "Let's go. Let's find this place." Travis looked at her with a gentle smile, understanding in his eyes. "I'm glad you've made your decision." And so, with a sense of determination and hope for the future, Zaitali and Alara began a new chapter in their lives. The road ahead wasn't clear, and the dangers of the past were never far behind. But for the first time in a long time, Zaitali felt a spark of optimism. She had a daughter to protect, and together, they could create a new beginning. A life filled with love, safety, and the possibility of a future where they could finally be free. As they prepared to leave, Zaitali looked back at the cabin one last time, the place where they had found shelter and healing. It was the beginning of something new, a fresh start, and with Alara by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next.